Bull Connor could not lay black and brown folks low, if Jim Clark in Selma could not lay black and brown folks low, if Lester Maddox in Georgia could not lay black and brown folks low, that Donald John Trump ain't gonna be the one, y'all. So just know that. So let's understand Trumpism, and first let's dispense with some of the nonsense, right? Because there are still a lot of people who would have us believe that everything I just said, however much it might be pretty rhetorically, that it isn't really fair, because after all, it's not right of me to suggest that Trumpism is first and foremost a white nationalist project. That it's not, oh, I hadn't said that yet, but I just did. But that's not fair, Tim, because, you know, these are folks who are first and foremost motivated by their economic anxiety. Here's how we know that that isn't true. Right. First, we know it's not true because if Trumpism were rooted mostly in economic anxiety, black and brown folks would have been lined up around the block to vote for him, right? Because when it comes to economic anxiety, people of color are the ones who always, both quantitatively and qualitatively, have a disproportionate share of it. African American folks, even who have a college degree, almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, regardless of major, by the way. Latino and Latina folks with a college degree, 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work, regardless of major. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, 23% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, 2/3 more likely to be unemployed even when they have a degree relative to white folks. So if economic anxiety were the principal driver, this would have been a multicultural, multiracial movement, unprecedented in the history of America, and I think it is safe to say that that is not what we saw. That isn't to say economic anxiety isn't in the picture, though. Right? See, this is the mistake we make in this country, I think, sometimes when we talk about class and race as separate phenomena, that we ignore that, yes, it was about economic anxiety, but only in relation to a backdrop of white supremacy and privilege. And what I mean by that is that white identity for hundreds of years, going back to the colonial period, has been about the connection symbolically of whiteness to a form of caste superiority, even when one's class position was wanting and lacking, right? In other words, it was the way to tell even the poorest white person that you're better than even the best off person who isn't designated as white. It was what W.E.B. Du Bois would later call the psychological wage of whiteness. And that is the coin of the realm in this culture and has been for a very long time, especially if you're suffering, right? Because if you're rich, this is redundant, right? This skin, this is redundant. For Donald Trump, this is redundant, right? For Bill Gates, this is redundant. For anyone who has a whole lot of money, right? For those 38 people in this country who have the same net worth as the bottom half, because those are the numbers, by the way, this is redundant. But for the poor, white, Appalachian coal miner or assembly line worker in Pennsylvania, this is often all they got, and they will cash that check, because this culture has told them that it has value. So that's our dilemma. It isn't that they don't suffer economic anxiety, it's that they suffer it, and by God, they weren't supposed to have to. Right? There's this thing called expectationalism, which I don't know if it's a thing, but it's a word. Maybe I made it up. I don't know. I like it. And one of the privileges and perks, I suppose, of being a white male is I can just make up words and get away with it. So I'm going to use that when it serves a positive function, right? Expectationalism, right, says to white folks, you are supposed to have the best of everything, but even if you don't, you'll at least always have this. So it isn't really shocking when a candidate for office would play on that. That's why I'm saying it's not new. It's not new at all. It's been around for a very long time. So it is about economic anxiety, but only against a backdrop of racial supremacy. Trumpism is predicated on a few things in particular that we've seen before. The first is, of course, nostalgia. It is first and foremost a nostalgic movement, right? That's why the hat says, "Make America Great Again," right? It doesn't say, "Let's make America great for the first time because we really haven't ever gotten it right before." Not only because that won't fit on the hat, but because the people who crafted the slogan wanted to appeal, much like the Tea Party did before them, to a nostalgic past. And I know a little something about nostalgia because, like I said, I'm from the South, and we do that with grits. Like, that is what we do, right? I mean, we had that song. You've heard the song, right? wish I were in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. And if y'all think the South lost the Civil War, you haven't been paying attention. Right? Just telling you the truth, see. Sometimes victories take a really long time to manifest and materialize, and folks go to sleep. But that's what we do. We do nostalgia. And the whole nation under Trumpism is gripped by that, the notion that once upon a time we were great. Now, they'll never tell you when you ask them when, right? Because I do that, because I'm pushy that way and obnoxious. And I'll say, well, when was it great? And they always are like, well, because they know any answer they give makes them sound like a jerk, right? They can't give a good answer they can't say the 50s, because then they're going to be like, oh yeah, wait, They can't say the 1911 like teens or something, because children are working in mines and factories. They know that sounds terrible, but in a way that's what they're thinking, right? That we want to go back to this age of supposed innocence when everything was wonderful. And so nostalgia makes up a big piece of it, and that's nothing new. The second thing Trumpism is predicated on is a backlash to real, or at least perceived gains, but often real gains made by people of color. If you want to understand what's going on in this country, it's one thing to come and listen to me, and I'm glad you're here, and I'm totally going to sell you books in a minute. So that's my subliminal. I'm a slick salesman like that. I just put it out there for you. But read mine for sure, but please read Carol Anderson's book. Carol Anderson, a brilliant scholar at Emory University, who wrote this book, White Rage, that came out about a year ago, maybe 15 months ago. It's a brilliant book. Because what she talks about, and she does it in only 148 or 172 pages or something, very quick, very brief, to the point, talking about how every single iteration of progress, specifically for black folks, but I think you can make the same analysis for peoples of color generally, every diminution of whiteness as power, every advance was met not just with the term backlash, which is almost a soft sell, right? But real rage, whether that was the rage that met the end of enslavement, right? The Reconstruction era met with intense hatred, and the resurrection of really slavery-like conditions for African-American folk throughout the South, a vicious resurgence of white supremacy, culminating, of course, in Jim Crow laws. When the Great Migration takes place and you have black folks moving north to escape conditions in the South, they are met with a significant rage in the Midwest and the Northeast and the industrial corridors of this country. Overt racial pogroms, we call them race riots, but that doesn't do it justice, right? Racial pogroms, orgies of violence that meet these migrants looking for work, right? Again, some themes repeat themselves over and over in our history, as we see right now with the way that we treat migrant labor as well. White rage that met the Brown versus Board of Education decision, a kind of rage that led entire school districts to simply shut down their public schools in the South, create white flight, so-called Christian academies where the white folks could go and end black schools or black schooling after 5th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade. It was a form of real rage. We saw it culminate not only in the South, in places like Boston, right? And there were desegregation crises out here, as you well know. And so, right, West Coast, East, South, all around the country, that kind of rage which met progress. And of course, then that culminates even beyond the desegregation backlash with the response to affirmative action, the response to the Fair Housing Act, all kinds of backlash that we saw throughout the 80s. And then, of course, with the advances signified or symbolized by the presidency of Barack Obama, you get birtherism, you get the Tea Party, you get this I want my country back mentality, putting aside how concrete the gains for black and brown folks really were in the years of the Obama administration, and we can debate that. I personally think there's a lot, of course, that was left on the table, so to speak. I don't put that on him. I put that on us and him. All of us together had to do more, didn't do enough. But the point is, it certainly was symbolic of advance. It was symbolic of progress, and it was met with the same kind of rage. And so what we're seeing with Trumpism is what we saw in the 60s and the early 70s. It's what we saw in the 1920s and the 1930s. It's what we saw in the 1890s, the 1870s, the 1880s, even some of the same rhetoric, right? The rhetoric of white victimhood, right? The idea that we're the ones now, that's what all the surveys say, white folks are locked in this not only nostalgia for the past, but this real fear that we're the ones being victimized. Not only the polls tell us that, YouTube tells us, right? Because you can get on YouTube. This one guy, you saw him in the Starbucks. This white man melted down in a Starbucks yelled at a black barista, called her everything but a child of God, used every possible racial slur, pointed out, I voted for Trump, like that was at all relevant to his latte purchase, right? But he apparently got bad service and wanted to let everybody know that, by God, I'm a Trump voter and you're and he uses the N-word, and it's all on video. And his point was that he feels oppressed because he got bad service at the Starbucks. Y'all, if you think that bad service at the Starbucks, like they put soy milk in and you ask for 2%, like if you think that that is oppression, you have just proven white privilege with a vengeance. Better than me or my books or Carol Anderson or her books or any person of color ever possibly could. Because if you think that's oppression, you don't know what oppression is. So thank you for the assist, in the pedagogical approach of what I'm trying to do. And there was the white woman in the Michaels in Chicago, right? Bought too much stuff to fit into the plastic bags that they give you. And so the black woman who was the clerk said, hey, we've got these, reusable, recyclable bags. It'll just be $1. Your stuff will fit in there better. And she goes ballistic, starts using racial slurs at her. Again, talks about being a Trump voter like it's relevant to her crafting or whatever she was doing with the stuff from Michael's. Once again, thinking that she's oppressed because they asked her to buy a $1 bag, y'all. A $1 bag was oppression. See, this is what Robin DiAngelo talks about as white fragility, right? This idea that we're just sort of like, and it's funny because these are the people that call progressives snowflakes, right? These are the people that, those of us who fight racism, well, you're snowflakes because you can't handle what? Like you get triggered too easily, you think everything is racism. So we're the snowflakes. This coming from people who sort of lost their mind when they redid Annie with a black character, right? These are... they redid Annie with a black actress and Jamie Foxx, and it was like, you can't redo Annie. It's a classic. She's an orphan and she has red hair, and then they made Rue black in the Hunger Games, and we're like, oh, no. You can't do that. So, sort of interesting when you call someone a snowflake and you melt that easily, but that's sort of where white rage is. It's gotten to this absurdity, but it's always been there. It was Justice Joseph Bradley of the Supreme Court in 1883 who first coined the concept of sort of reverse discrimination against white people when he, along with his colleagues, threw out many of the Reconstruction era civil rights laws by saying that it was time for the Negro to stop being the special favorite of the law and join the rest of us as mere citizens, right? This is sort of ironic considering that up until a few years before, only whites could be citizens and were considered as such. But now all that special treatment, the Freedmen's Bureau, which lasted about a minute, and the Freedmen's Bank, which lasted about another minute, was too much favoritism. So again, this stuff has been around, and I want us to remember that because folks fought that then, and we don't have to be disheartened now. It's really not a unique moment. It just goes to show that, as I think we might all know, Donald Trump didn't really think of something new, right? This isn't some new stuff, right? It's a lot easier to fight the monster when you've seen him before. That's all I'm saying. The third thing that Trumpism is predicated on is this long-standing divide and conquer thing. Now, I think I probably talked about this last time I was here, and I looked at the video this morning because I don't want to repeat myself. But then Albert, my buddy, he says to me, Tim, when the Stones play, they still do Satisfaction. So I was like, okay, all right. Well, I'm not Mick Jagger, and y'all ain't paying me like the Stones, but if I did repeat this, if I am being repetitive here, it's because it's an important tune and an important note to hit, right? The history of the country is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. I mean, that's America sort of in a nutshell when it comes to race and class, right? If you had to put I don't know, it may be too many syllables for a haiku, but it's like basically if you had to come up with a very short phrase that you could, I don't know, maybe too long for a bumper sticker also, but it's the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It begins in the colonial period, right, when whiteness wasn't even a thing yet. There was no white race. We didn't love each other. We spent most of our time in Europe killing each other. The English hated the Irish hated them back. Northern Italians didn't consider Southern Italians to even be Italian. Right? The Germans hated everyone, and the feeling was quite often mutual. Right? I mean, the history of Europe was sort of the history of killing one another and looking for the witch, alternately. That was the other thing we did a lot. We didn't consider ourselves one big happy family. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1700s, there becomes a need for this thing called the white race. Well, what changed, right? What changed was rich folks looked around, started counting, and realized they were heavily outnumbered. When you take African enslaved folks, European indentured servants, just one level above enslavement, when you look at other peasants in the European group who maybe weren't indentured, you put them together, they outnumber the elite, right? You had a handful of folks that owned all the stuff, and everybody else working for them. See, some things really don't change. 400 years on, we're back to that, right? And so they looked around and realized they had to figure out a way to get some of those poor Europeans on their team. They create the notion of whiteness, the white race, give out little perks here and there. You can enter into contracts, testify in court. You can vote, at least if you're male. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? It's not real power. You know, you're on the slave patrol. You don't own the land, right? You know, and this is important in an era of police misconduct in our country to understand. This is the bright line of the first iteration of law enforcement was slave patrol, right? And black and brown folks know that. See, knowing your history is really important because I gather that a lot of white Americans don't know that history that stretches from slave patrols to the present. And if you don't understand that, and you don't understand the way in which black life has been discounted so regularly, then a phrase like, let alone a movement like Black Lives Matter won't make sense to you, right? And then you'll say things like, well, but what about my life? But all lives matter, don't I? But what about me? I know all lives matter, precious. I know. I got 2 white children. I know. You don't have to tell me that their lives matter. The problem is every police officer in America knows already. And every teacher in America knows, and every employer knows, and every bank loan officer knows that their lives matter and that their credit record probably won't. See, that's the difference. Right? But if you don't know the history, including the slave patrol history all the way up to the present, lots of misconduct in the Los Angeles area. If you don't know enough about it, just watch, I think it was episode 2 of the 5-part OJ documentary on ESPN. You'll know all you need to know about the history of the LAPD. And it'll put everything in perspective for you if you didn't already know. Right now, you could have just asked some black folks and they would have told you. Could have just asked some Latinx folks and they would have told you. But a lot of times we just don't know this stuff because we haven't been taught. Not your fault. Right? I wasn't taught it. I took AP history. That's the history for smart people. And they still didn't teach me about that. So you can't know what you weren't taught. You can't teach what you don't know. So anyway, the divide and conquer starts in the 1700s. And all of a sudden, the cross-racial rebellions that had begun to foment, begin not to foment, begin to diminish, and whiteness becomes stronger. The Civil War era is the same thing. You got rich white folks telling poor white folks that they got to go out and fight because the rich don't fight. The rich aren't going to fight to keep their own property interest in other human beings. They're going to get poor people to do that. Rich people, if y'all aren't clear on this, don't fight wars. They get poor people to do the dirty work for them. They get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs and can't go to Vietnam. That's what rich people do. And if y'all don't know who I'm talking about, you can just Google that. That's what the internet is for, y'all.